Welcome to Talking Fossils. I'm joined today by Susan Newell, a PhD researcher. Susan is looking at the historical teaching collection of a gentleman named William Buckland. And Susan, in her PhD research, stumbled across a Mary Anning fossil. So thank you very much for talking to us today, Susan. So thank you very much for joining me today. So we're going to start off with a simple question, I hope. How did you get into your research area?
Yeah, no, I'd love to share my project with the Jurassic Coast Trust. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm a doctoral student based at the University of Leeds. But actually I'm mainly at the partner institution, which is this beautiful building here, Oxford University Museum of Natural History, because I'm studying the historical geological collections of William Buckland, who was the first professor of geology at Oxford.
Ah, that's really interesting. So how did you get into the history of geology and that kind of area?
Well, it's a bit of a strange story. In fact, I knew a little bit about Buckland, but only because he was in the Geological Society and he was part of a really influential group at the heart of the society who lobbied government to establish this building, this beautiful building, the Museum of Practical Geology. And it was really set up from the Geological Survey organised by his friend Henry Della Beach, who you see on the left here. And I actually, a bit strangely, I think, for many geologists, but I started looking at the ceramics collection of this museum. And you might think, well, why on earth did Della Beach want ceramics in a geological museum? Well, he was really interested in the applications of geology. So here on the right, you see his first guidebook of the huge ceramics collection that he amassed at this museum, and it's now in the Victoria and Albert Museum today. And in my sort of former career, I was a museum curator and I worked for a while at the V&A. And I was asked an inquiry from a member of the public about a piece in the collection, and it turned out that it was from this geological collection and that nobody knew anything about it. And so that started me off on my research into geological history and this museum and their collections. And that's how I actually got into the history of geology. So it's a bit of a strange journey, but it was really, really great fun to do.
Yeah, I think all the best journeys are strange ones, aren't they? So can you tell us a little bit, then you've made that journey and you started in the history of geology. Can you tell us a bit about your research, your PhD research that you're now doing?
Sure. Yes, well, as I say, I'm interested in this man, William Buckland, and actually he never taught at that beautiful building I showed you in the first slide. He taught here at the Old Ashmolean Museum, and you can see him here in full flow giving a lecture to the great and good of Oxford, and obviously some normal students amongst there, but yeah, he had the most incredible teaching collection. And my project claims that teaching collections are really important for for how scientific knowledge was constructed. Well, they are still today, I think, but also particularly in the early 19th century. And this collection is so rare because it actually survives. When you think about teaching materials, I mean, they're dynamic, they change, they get revised, they get chucked out, they get worn and torn. And you know, it's just incredible that Buckland's teaching collection, for the most part, survives at Oxford today in the Museum of Natural History. So that's what I'm really interested in looking at.
That was fascinating. How do you know how he sourced his collection?
Yes, I mean, that is really a very key part of my project. I mean, he was an incredible sort of field worker in his own right. He travelled all over Britain. He travelled in Europe as well, collecting fossil and mineral specimens. And he went as far south as Mount Etna on Sicily. He had to see an active volcano, you can imagine. But I'm also interested in all the other people that were part of his network who contributed to his collection. So there were lots of private collectors, among whom there were quite a few women whose stories I'm trying to discover a bit more about. Let me show you a little bit more. There were naval and diplomatic officers, you can see here on the lower left. some incredible mammoth tusks that were presented to Buckland by Captain Beechey from an area of the northwest American coast, now part of Alaska. And also there are sort of much more ephemeral sort of hints in the archives that I've been looking at that tell us a bit more about Buckland buying specimens from dealers. You can see a sort of rather scruffy old receipt here on the top left, and also little jottings and notes, receipts from quarrymen. There's a wonderful receipt from this quarryman in Stonesfield near Oxford, where Buckland bought a lot of his Megalosaurus fossils. And of course there are all the fossilists from the coast, particularly the south coast. And of course, the most important one of these was, of course, Mary Anning, who was really important for Buckland's research.
Yeah, so that's where our stories kind of come together, really. How did Buckland know Mary Anning?
Yeah, I'd love to tell you a bit more about that. I mean, he grew up actually in East Devon at Axmouth, just near Axmouth. And his father was a clergyman there, and the sort of coast around Lyme Regis, I think, was part of his stomping ground when he was a schoolboy. And I'm sure he must have met Mary Anning and her father in the sort of really early days of their fossil collecting. And when he became sort of really serious about fossils, when he was in geology and or he was already thinking, I think, about developing a sort of much more serious interest and joining the Geological Society of London. He then, we know he used to go during the university holidays and visit her. And when he became a professor there at geology, he would help her a little bit by getting some of his really wealthy friends to buy some of her expensive specimens. And actually, I've got a brilliant example here of one of these. This is the so-called Duke of Buckingham's brute. Now, the Duke of Buckingham was a sort of patron of Buckland, and he bought this incredible plesiosaur specimen, which is now, of course, in the Natural History Museum in London. But Buckland commissioned a cast of this specimen. Actually, he got his friend, the famous artist Francis Chantry, who had a plaster workshop in his studio, to make a cast of this incredible fossil. And Chantry there's a wonderful correspondence about this, and Chantry got very fed up because it took over all his workman's time making this incredible cast. But anyway, here it is still on the wall in the Natural History Museum. And Connie Bear, Buckland's friend, published an article about it, and here you can see a lithograph by the artist George Sharp, which shows this same fossil today. So we know that Mary Anning was just really important to Buckland's work. He often tested out his ideas, we think, by discussing with her. After he got married to Mary Moreland in 1825, he and Mary used to visit Lyme quite regularly with their growing family. And we know that Mary, always in her letter, she asks after Buckland's wife, she says, "Give my best regards to Mary," to Mrs. Buckland. No, actually, she never called her Mary. She's very, very respectful. But the children, especially the eldest boy, little Frankie, he used to go fossil hunting with Mary Anning, we know. So yeah, it was a nice, friendly connection. And I mean, Buckland, you think he was a kind of Oxford don and somebody quite important in lots of ways, but he wasn't a kind of stuffy character. He seems to have been quite friendly, and he had a really good sense of humour. And yeah, the sort of differences in class didn't really make any difference. I mean, you can tell that he's really respects Mary Anning, and he pays her due regard in his publications, and also in a presidential address that he gave to the Geological Society. He pays tribute to her. So yeah, I think he was quite a good supporter of Mary.
Yeah, it's good for the time. You never know kind of how these relationships were with women in the field. You just don't know. But it seems like he did celebrate quite a lot of her work, but potentially not the fossil fish that you kind of rediscovered as being a piece of Mary Anning's through your research. So how did you make that connection with Mary Anning and the fossil fish?
Yeah, this was a really nice piece of luck that sort of happens sometimes when you're doing research. And I happened to be sort of looking into different ways that Buckland sourced his collection. And I was looking in the archives at a letter from one of his former students, a very wealthy young man called Beriah Botfield. And Beriah was sort of writing to his old geology professor and telling him about his trip to Scotland and how he'd been looking at different regions and discussing the geology with him. And he sort of just drops into the letter, sort of with no preamble. He just says, "Oh, and by the way, I've got Mary Anning sent me some lovely fossils, a Dipedium, a sort of fossil fish, and an Ichthyosaurus fossil, and I've got those at home for you." And that's it. And then he just goes on talking about something completely different. So they obviously were very familiar with the subject. They didn't need to elaborate between them. And I sort of asked the head of Earth Collections at Oxford, have you come across this fossil fish or this Ichthyosaurus specimen that we can link to Mary Anning? And it certainly wasn't on the computer database. And everyone just thought, well, maybe it got broken, or it's just, the collection's moved over the years. Different things happen, sadly, over time, and things do occasionally get lost. But I happened to be in the store on one of my very rare visits to Oxford last year. And yeah, there I saw in a corner on the wall this incredible specimen that says presented by Beriah Botfield and Dipedium polytum, the name of the specimen at the time, and line Dorset. And this must be that incredible specimen. So I was thrilled to see it. And the curators very kindly took it off the wall for me and allowed us to take off this slate, this roofing slate, which had sealed the fossil at the back, so we could see how it had been put together and how it had been unearthed in pieces, and how you can see the sort of discolored cement around the side of the matrix that you can see there, and these sort of infills of cement as well. So this is all really fascinating to see how something was put together and how Mary worked. And you can see at the front, she's actually coloured the cement so that it doesn't show and just blends in with the matrix of the stone. And yeah, I mean, Beriah Botfield got this specimen mounted, and just being able to link it up with our archival reference, that's just really rare and exciting for somebody like me doing research. So I was really, really thrilled to find it, and it was just a really good piece of luck.
It's almost as exciting as if you were Mary Anning finding it for the first time, so that rediscovery. Do you think that there's more of these sorts of connections somewhere in your PhD?
Well, there could be. I mean, I'd love to think that the Ichthyosaurus specimen that Beriah Botfield mentions will come to light one day, but the curators have looked and looked, and it's certainly not in the collection framed in this way. And it was really only the fact that Botfield wanted to memorialize his presentation to the museum that we know that it was given by him. I mean, of course, Mary isn't mentioned anywhere there, which is quite normal, sadly, for the fossilists who did all the hard work. But yeah, it may be that other specimen has been lost. But I mean, there are researchers working in this area. I mean, Tom Sharp, who's written this, recent amazing biography of Mary Anning, he's sort of looking into this area. So maybe more things will come to light. Yeah.
Let's hope so. Speaking about Mary Anning, and then you've mentioned Buckland's wife as well. What do you think it would have been like for women in this field during this kind of male-dominated fossil collecting era?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know very little about the other women fossilists. I mean, I'm sure there must have been quite a few of them, and I think it's great that Mary Anning was literate, and lots of people wrote about her and mentioned her in their correspondence. And she was clearly highly respected among fossil collectors. So we've got quite a lot of information about her. But apart from that, sadly, I'm not sure how many women are known who were actually doing that hard work. We know more about people who did illustrations of natural history at the time. And, you know, I mentioned Mary Moreland, Buckland's wife, whom I'm showing you a slide of here because she's one of my favorite characters in my project. Just finding out more about her has been really exciting. So yeah, I mean, she was working for Buckland doing scientific illustrations for several years before their marriage. And he even sort of organized for her to do illustrations for other people as well, sort of very important people like the director of the Natural History Museum in Paris, George Cuvier, no less. He published some of Mary's illustrations in his books on fossil bones. And I mean, Mary did incredible other lithographs for Buckland, and she did enlarged drawings for his teaching collection. Yeah, because when he was teaching, he liked to kind of make a jigsaw of different kind of elements in his teaching. He would have the specimens, he would have illustrations, he would have maps. So he would really kind of try and bring the subject to life for his students in all these different kind of visual ways. And over the top, of course, he would be giving his presentation verbally as well. So it was kind of very much a kind of combined assault on his students' intelligence as he kind of presented everything, and people absolutely loved his lectures. I mean, he had a huge following at Oxford at the time. But I think, you know, people like Mary Moreland tend to get a bit sort of, you know, pushed to the side in the past, and it's bringing out all these stories that's so exciting about my project. I mean, there, just to show you the top right there, there's a picture of the Landslip drawing. Well, it's actually the lithograph after her drawing. I've got a better picture here of it that you can see. This is her teaching illustration on the left of the famous Bindon or Axmouth landslip, sorry, that happened in 1839 at Christmas time. And of course, the Bucklands happened to be on holiday at Axmouth at the time, staying just 5 miles inland. And you can imagine how exciting it must have been for them to go down to the coast and see this incredible event when the whole of the coast sort of collapsed in upon itself. I mean, fortunately, I don't think anyone was injured, but it must have been an extraordinary event at the time. And we know that lots of famous people went to visit it, no less Queen Victoria sailed past in her steam yacht, I think, at the time. But we know also, very importantly, that Mary Anning visited the Landslip with the Bucklands. I mean, I'm sure she went on her own before then, but yeah, so it was a really incredible event at the time. And yeah, these enlarged teaching diagrams are really fascinating. That we know they were used, they were pinned up, just if you can remember the initial slide I showed of Buckland teaching, he had boards behind him where he had maps and illustrations pinned up. And these illustrations, teaching diagrams, have metal eyelets where you can see he was able to pin them up without damaging them too much. But yeah, it's amazing they survived, really, like I say. So it just gives us an insight into how teaching took place and how sort of geological knowledge was passed on and created at the time. I just wanted to finish by telling you about some of Buckland's teaching illustrations. And this is one of my favorites. This is a wonderful Anning specimen that she found in 1831. A fabulous ichthyosaurus, and that Buckland commissioned the artist George Scharf to do a teaching illustration for him of this specimen. I think he must have paid Scharf to go up to Hemel Hempstead, where the buyer lived. The buyer was a really famous surgeon and anatomist, a man called Astley Cooper. And it's recorded that he bought this specimen from Mary Anning for £40. And Scharf drew it life size. It was about 1 metre long. And this, I was just thinking about what you were saying about the treasure of Buckland's collection. And Scharf has really made this specimen look like buried treasure, with the sort of glowing bones and this sort of really coppery colours that he's used. And it's really exciting because I think it's about 10 years now since this specimen was rediscovered, the actual specimen, in the Natural History Museum in London by curators there. Yeah, I have to say the specimen is amazing from the photographs I've seen of it, but it doesn't look like this. It doesn't sort of glow out quite like this. And Scharf has really sort of used his artistry to make it into the most a wonderful illustration of a fossil, and it's characteristic of quite a few of his works in Buckland's collection. And it just, I love the fact that it shows this kind of interface of art and science, and how artists contributed so much to geological knowledge at the time, and to how it was spread and yeah, became part of people's sort of consciousness, really. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you. A fabulous Anning specimen, and there's a lovely record actually of the buyer Astley Cooper talking about Mary Anning. I've got a little lovely quote here. He said she was a great genius whose knowledge, zeal and ability are really surprising. I mean, obviously we have to ignore the rather condescending tone, which unfortunately was characteristic at the time, but you know, it's nice to think that in the sort of gentlemen's clubs Mary Anning was being praised for her skills and her genius at her work, even by, you know, by people who sort of were rather prominent in society at the time, who relied on her to find these incredible things, which then they could show off in their own collections. So yeah, I just wanted to share that with you, and sort of hope that yeah, there's more things to come out hopefully about Anning's involvement with Buckland, but yeah, maybe there's more secrets there to be found, but this is one of my favorites for the time being.
Yeah, that is all so interesting. I'd love to learn a lot more about it, but I'll let you do the research.
Yeah. Well, it's great fun for me.
So is there anything else that you think that people might be interested in about your research, and how it relates to the fossilists of the time, either on the Jurassic Coast or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think, I mean, Buckland's collection is really, really diverse. We don't know exactly the full extent of it. Lots of things are still even coming to light, as we mentioned earlier. I mean, we're lucky that Mary Buckland did mark a lot of his specimens. She developed a special script where she actually wrote on the specimens very clearly. I think, you know, she really took over curating his collection once they were married. So that's bringing out all kinds of things, you know, identifying and recognizing her handwriting on specimens, sort of, you know, tells us more about Buckland's collection, but it also importantly tells us about the sort of invisible work behind the scenes of people like Mary, the sisters, the wives, the daughters who did lots of work, and they all contributed to the making of scientific knowledge in different ways. And this, I think, is a really sort of interesting sort of alternative science history that my project is really, you know, situated in that side of science history, bringing out all these hidden stories. So no, I mean, I hope there's going to be more, and I keep finding things that, you know, they may not fit into my thesis, but hopefully I'll be able to write them up afterwards and share them with everybody. So.
Oh, thank you so much. It's all been so interesting, and absolute best of luck for the rest of your PhD and research career afterwards.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to share my project with you. So thanks so much for inviting me.